You are watching Notepad. I'm your host Ibrahim Sani. Last week you saw two big settlements in terms of the 1MDB story, where AmBank decided to do a global settlement at 2.83 billion and has settled with MOF regarding their participation in 1MDB. And late last week we've seen how Deloitte was also reportedly settled. This is coming to a point where the Finance Minister Tengku Datuk Sri Zafrul Abdul Aziz has confirmed that the Malaysian government has agreed to a settlement of about 80 million US dollars or about 324 million ringgit with Deloitte PLT in relation to the audit firm's relationship and also engagement with 1MDB. So the story is on not just about AmBank and Deloitte. The story is also about how do we move forward from the biggest global corporate scandal that the world has ever seen. And because this has happened 6 years ago, if you think about it, when the first enlightenment came about, and about what, 8 years ago, even 9 years ago, when lawmakers started to raise questions when it comes to 1MDB. So the story is a very long one to be told, and the crisis is still developing. Datuk Sri Najib is still out of jail despite being found guilty, for instance. We've seen a lot of other actors that are going in and out of the courts, trying to get their case sorted out by the judiciary system. So what does this mean with corporate Malaysia? Joining us is Dr. Veerinderjeet Singh, the Chairman of Tricor. Dr. Verinder, thanks for taking the time to speak with us. It's a very long, drawn story, and the sad part here is that, Dr. Verinder, it's going to continue on dominating the headlines for years to come. Let's hear some of your perspectives when it comes to this story.
Yes, thank you for having me, Ibrahim, on the show. As you had alluded to, this basically relates to a corporate scandal. But as you know, that if you were to take such issues to court, you might even talk about 12, 15 years range of period before things could get settled, right? So these are the challenges we have. And as you have seen in many countries where we've had some corporate scandals and the relevant actors are taken to court, as you know, the legal process is a long and winding road. And this perhaps leads us to these questions about we talk about fairness, we talk about the fact that everyone has a right to go to court. You move and then you appeal further and so on. And the question really sometimes crops up in my mind, if you go into the legal process, why do we allow the legal process to be so long? Why should it be, sometimes magistrates court, high court, court of appeal, federal court? Maybe you should only have 2 levels. I don't know. But this, my fellow lawyer friends will probably object to that. So that's one. The other thing really at the end of the day is that there could be 2 ways of settling this kind of issues. One is if there is really an offense, and if there is usually a criminal offense, then you take it to the court. The relevant regulators perhaps should frame some charges and take the particular parties to court, and then you will see it pan out as you pointed out earlier, that it will take a long while, right? That's one. The other option is what the government, I think, decided to take, not only this current government, as the previous government as well, was to look at trying to bring the so-called actors in the whole scandal to book, to realize the moral duty and say that you were somehow involved and we just wanted to settle, otherwise we go to court or something like that. And so in the end of the day, this is about a moral suasion, moral duty. There could be a legal element in the sense that there could be, instead of going for a criminal case, one settles it like this by a settlement. So, but you must remember one thing, the settlement doesn't mean that a person is guilty, right? It simply is a way in which to get this so-called cloud over you, potential cloud, potential issues, and to take out the possibility that if you may ever be taken to court. And you must remember one thing, in all these scandals, the challenge is determining and framing the actual charge. and we have never heard of any charges being framed as well, right? So at the end of the day, we must remember that there are many players, and as you use the word, many actors in this whole scheme of things, in this corporate scandal that we talk about. There are many lessons to learn. I think so in the end of the day, going forward, will this situation like this scandal that we have seen and many other scandals in other parts of the world, will this repeat itself? And I dare say it will, simply because it's all about human greed. It's all about humans, right? We can have all kinds of legislation and laws in place, but in the end of the day, it's humans who implement the law. It's humans who then make decisions. So, but we can tighten rules. We can tighten corporate governance. So I think to us, what is important is that the government has done is trying to settle this so that you take it out of the frame. And the reason why the government has gone about settling this is perhaps simply to shorten the time frame, right? And to get the relevant parties to pay up a certain amount. How these amounts were arrived at is unclear, but nevertheless, there could be some basis that we can allude to. And the idea of this is because of this. In this particular case, in the 1MDB, it's all about commitments, financial commitments that the government has. And that through 1MDB, in terms of the bonds and so on, there are bond holders. There is a need to keep paying your coupon payments because the bonds are long term. That's a legal obligation. So where is the money coming from to make all these payments? So what is happening is that I think the government has sort of, well, negotiated appropriately or made some suggestions, and the parties involved have come to the table and said, fine, we'll settle this. That money goes into that kitty, which is to be used to make the settlements and payments for all the relevant financial commitments related to 1MDB. Otherwise, it's you and I as taxpayers actually having to pay for all this, because remember, another part we can discuss later is about all these government guarantees that are given for various relevant ministry-related entities, right? And usually that's how it operates. It has to, because the government has to guarantee that. It's a government project, right? And so when the government guarantees it, the government is saddled with the responsibility. And this 1MDB scandal shows us very clearly how the government can get saddled with such a huge responsibility if corporate governance and human greed is not managed well.
Yeah, Verinder, we all want corporate governance to be managed well. However, it doesn't seem to be applied across the same standard across the board. One of the bigger reasons why I'm raising this is we've seen how news reports have reprimanded, for instance, traders who flaunt the rules. SC, for instance, have reprimanded, taken to court some companies or the board of directors. Bursa just late last week was reprimanding one trader for using their clients' money to trade on Bursa Malaysia, for instance. So yes, enforcement does happen, but it doesn't happen at the #1 role. Until we change the government, only then did Najib go to court, and only then did we find Najib being found guilty of all charges and was sentenced to 12 years in jail. Of course, his case is still pending in the courts, but that doesn't seem to, corporate governance doesn't seem to apply to everyone.
So let me just point out a few dynamics here. Perhaps it's a good time for me to just take a step back and, for the interest of viewers as well and listeners, to look at this scenario a little bit more carefully. The point to note is that when you look at corporate governance, it is the governance process that is placed, that is relevant to that particular entity or the particular advisor or the particular investor. So when you look at, let's use an example, even of the entity itself, the 1MDB entity and so on. How was it set up? What does its constitution say? And does its constitution go beyond the normal constitutions that you expect for a company. And I think it did. It gave certain other levels of power. So we all know that in corporate governance, the board of directors is the highest level. But it appears that in 1MDB, it was not the case. And so if I were asked to sit on the board of a company, first thing now, lesson to learn for us, is that I would look at, first of all, the constitution of that company. Is anything different from the standard constitution that is allowed in the Companies Act that we have? And by the way, you can have modifications. You can add a bit more powers if you want, but you follow the general frame, but you can add more. So if a company adds more, and for example, you have a board of directors, and then you also have a board of advisors separately, that already is a red flag, right? So if I were to see that in a group or in an entity that I was invited to, that would raise a red flag, and I probably would take a step back. Why is there a need to have something, or a particular level of maybe decision making or just advisory capacity above the board, right? So the board of directors is supreme. So that's one. So I would look at that from that point of view, that we all as directors on boards of companies would need to make sure we do our due diligence. And in the past, this hasn't happened that rigorously. And to be fair, the issue is this. If I'm invited to sit on the board of a company which is totally owned by the Ministry of Finance or any other ministry, would I give second thoughts to saying no? And most people will say yes, because it's government. You are a bit secure. There will be probably government guarantees in terms of whatever transactions they would do. As people take the view that that is the case. I think the 1MDB lesson tells us that we need to be very, very careful. And you're right. In the case of 1MDB, perhaps the question that's come to mind is what happened to the board of directors, right? And so when you look at the reprimands that we recently saw by other companies, listed companies, the board directors being fined and so on, the issue is that's for listed companies, and the 1MDB entity wasn't listed. So that's the other side you got to think about it. But at the end of the day, you also heard of cases where a company takes action against his former board of directors. I think 2 such cases came in the public limelight. And then I think one of them later withdrew that particular case as well. So these are things that are happening. But at the end of the day, corporate governance is about the board of directors ensuring there is a secure set of processes in place, policies in place, and then and giving the relevant mandate to senior manager and run it, but from time to time oversight over it. But you cannot be involved in the day-to-day operations, right? So corporate governance really is about clear set of policies, and you should be very clear that no one should be overriding the board of directors. And I think in the cases of ministry-owned entities, maybe even in the old days, some of the GLCs, you seem to have a higher power which can make those decisions. And that's where I think we are now seeing a change. And we're seeing a lot of companies, including GLCs, being managed more efficiently in terms of the board of directors. And I think there are some lessons to learn and things to do and what we can improve, right? So we need to bear that in mind. Now, when you look at reprimands by the regulators, obviously regulators have the set of guides, the provisions of the Act, and the various penalty clauses that they can enforce. And I think Bursa, Malaysia, Securities Commission, 2 main regulators in the capital markets, are doing their job accordingly. But sometimes perhaps it could have been done faster. It could have been done more rigorously. And maybe in some situations you could say it should have been done consistently. But to be fair, they have to do their homework. the groundwork, the investigations, and sometimes it takes an awful lot of time. But I am hopeful that the regulators will step up and perhaps do what they are doing and do it more efficiently. And in the end of the day, it's a question of empowerment. And I think all our regulators have the powers. I think we have been seeing a lot of activity in the past. And the concerns people have is the recent issue of 1MDB. Why didn't the regulator step in? But you must remember, it was not a listed company. So there are different things you need to do. You couldn't have Bursa reprimanding 1MDB because it wasn't a listed company. So, and at the end of the day, it's the MOF which can take action, and which is how I think the MOF has been very persistent in the way in which it's pursued some settlements. And that's because it is an MOF company. It is government guaranteed bonds. Government is now saddled with the responsibility of making those payments to bondholders, or financing those particular payments. And so the government has got the is the one which is a stakeholder, the main stakeholder, and therefore the government is instituting action in such a case. So we must be aware that's the case. But it doesn't mean that the board of directors of the entity it doesn't have any role to play. They do. And that's where, again, the main shareholder must take action against a relevant party. So they could take action against the board, they can take action against senior management, take them to court. And I bring to light one other case in the past, the Transmile case, if you are aware. Yes. It's still going in the courts. And that's an example where when I first made my opening comments, how many years has it been since the Transmile case is going on? So, but to be fair, that's a legal process, right? And it can drag on. And we've seen this even in this current case, how we call them smart lawyers, but then again, using the law.
The issue here is, Verinda, is not corporate governance then. The issue here is government governance. No, the government governance. When 1MDB chairman is Datuk Seri Najib, and the Minister of Finance is Datuk Seri Najib, the Prime Minister is Datuk Seri Najib, and all the rot has gotten straight to the core, there seems to be no governance to speak of. And because he has been found guilty, it is fair to say now that we cannot have another form of poor government governance to permeate. If corporate governance is all in place, then what is government governance then?
So that means that if you have a single shareholder of an entity, right, you appoint a board of directors, you apparently empower the board of directors to make decisions, but the single shareholder also has representatives on the board, and but the issue here must be that if you're looking at corporate governance, not only at listed companies, but at Berhads, and we're not talking about Sdn Berhads, but Sdn Berhads have a lower level in terms of need to, but maybe they should. Making sure that boards of directors have, more than 50% of their directors being independent directors. That's perhaps one step, right? And therefore, the issue of decision-making powers, because if it's MOF, Minister of Finance, Prime Minister is all involved in a company, you need to step in to disallow that. So the government needs to take those steps, right? Sometimes a minister is involved in a particular company because through his nominees, because it comes under the purview of the minister. Now, the government needs to take a step back to say that, yes, I can appoint my nominees. I also need to appoint some independent directors. And the question is, should I have a majority independent directors so that you lift the game up in terms of corporate governance? And that is not happening in terms of ministry or government related companies, right? Especially those directly owned by the relevant ministry. So that's a point to make. So, and that is incumbent on the government to take steps to do that. it's nothing to do with Companies Act or even Securities Commission or Bursa. It's really the government making the steps. So I think that's a lesson that we all obviously have learned.
It is a lesson that cost billions of ringgit of your money and my money, Doctor. We already discussed how 7% of Malaysians in total paid income tax. These are the folks that were ripped off of our cash. And if it's incumbent upon the government to act upon what the government does, it's exactly like saying, I am responsible for regulating my own actions, failure of which no one will come and get me because I am my own regulator. This surely cannot be the process, Veerinder.
I agree. So that's why this lesson in terms of the 1MDB issue, unfortunately, you'll find that somehow because it's complicated, because it's a lot of financial shenanigans, many people, it's above their head, and therefore many people are not aware of this. But the educated segment is aware, and this is financial fraud. So to me, at the end of the day, it's, we vote in a government. We expect the government then to behave properly. We know that past governments have not behaved properly. So what do? So as taxpayers and voters, the only thing we can do, we can make some noise. But in the end of the day, it's also the regulatory bodies here advising the government and pushing the government. But sometimes you have a problem. The relevant key persons in the regulatory body are also appointed by the government, right? So sometimes we very, very upstanding individuals, but the question then is, do we have a situation where because you've been appointed, let's say, by the Minister of Finance to this particular role, are you beholden to the Minister of Finance for the appointment? And we need to break this particular linkage, because that's the culture we have, the feudalistic culture. And if you're appointed because of the skills you have, leadership skills, the upstanding way in which you run your corporate life, that's why you're appointed. So, but whatever it is, human nature is such that I feel beholden. And sometimes if you are instructed to do something and it can be done within the context of what you do, you can perhaps not take action on a certain area. Perhaps it's not take light action and not severe action. Look, these things are all happening in every country in some ways, but we need to manage that. And then the first thing really starts with the government. Government has to ensure that all government-related entities will be managed in this particular manner. Now, that brings us back to this issue of appointment of politicians as well, right? To boards. So we are seeing a step that is, I don't know, we've taken steps back. We've taken many steps forward, but sometimes we've taken steps back. And then yet,
like you and me affect change and make sure that this is stopped, essentially. A politician's job is to stay in parliament and not be sitting on the boards of Marala, whatever you have.
So that's 101. It's of corporate governance. So, and we expect the government to do that. But you can justify many things in many ways, but we need to see ourselves moving up the ladder in terms of the game. You cannot simply say, this is allowed, I haven't broken the rules, but the moral duty comes in. Should I be looking at, and then you come back to this issue of ethics, very difficult word to even define. And the ethics, the individual has their own inbuilt value system, right? And it's amazing how so many upstanding individuals in the corporate life suddenly perhaps.
Veerinda, I've got to object. Ethics can only be kicked in if there is a legal penalty attached to it. I think that's the only way for you to.
Two sides. One is education through when young, how parents, how teachers teach you what you're taught in schools, universities, the ethical side of it. That's one. The second really is when you are in a corporate life and do something, there's always these penalties that hang over you, and that's in our laws. So you're right. The next question is, are the penalties severe enough, right, to warrant you making sure that I do things right? So you're right. That's how it should be. And the ethics part is very difficult. We look at corporate governance. You look at all these courses that directors attend, training. We talk a lot about ethics, and we all fundamentally know what it means. But you know, when you're faced with an actual situation, it's not right or wrong. It's a question of lesser rather than more. Can you live with it? You're not breaking a rule, but
No,
you
no.
are.
It has to be legal or illegal. And because of that, that is how we regulate both corporate Malaysia as well as government of Malaysia.
Correct.
All right, Belinda, I'm so sorry, but we've reached the end of our show, and I would like to have you more on the show. We'll reach out to you in the next few weeks to come. But for now, that's it for this particular episode. If you've missed any part of this episode, just head on to astro.com. Look for Notepad over there. Until then, thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.